I will take the name Mexican enemies have given me. The whites will learn it, and you will learn it.
He was a symbol of loyalty, bravery, and strength to millions of Americans who tuned in every week to watch the Lone Ranger. But behind that calm, noble face of Tonto was a man fighting a very different battle. One against a system that wanted his image, but not his truth. Jay Silverheels, the first Native American actor to achieve national fame on television, carried a legacy far deeper than the role that made him famous. To the public, he was a sidekick, the quiet companion riding faithfully beside the masked hero. To himself, he was a man torn between pride in his heritage and the painful realization that Hollywood had turned it into a caricature. Decades after his death, his words still echo. Tonto is stupid. It wasn't anger he felt, but sorrow. Sorrow that his people's first major representation on screen had to come dressed in servitude. Yet Jay's story isn't just about injustice. It's about endurance, about a man who rose from poverty, pushed through prejudice and made history, even as it quietly broke him. Long before he became Jay Silverheels, he was Harold J. Smith, born on May 26, 1912, in the Six Nations of the Grand River Reserve near Hagersville, Ontario. Life on the reserve was simple but hard. Harold was one of at least 10 children crammed into a small wooden home. The winters were cold, the food often scarce, and opportunity was a word few people around him ever used. His father, Alexander George Edwin Smith, had gone to war a hero. He fought in the trenches of World War I, earning the Military Cross for bravery, an honor that should have guaranteed respect and stability when he came home. Instead, the government handed him $49 a month and left him on a small farm with broken hearing and a body full of shrapnel. The war medals gleamed, but they didn't feed the family. They didn't stop the headaches that left him wincing in silence, or the ringing that followed him through every waking hour. Harold watched his father struggle daily to keep their land and dignity, while his mother, Mabel, worked tirelessly to hold everything together. She was part Mohawk, part Seneca, a woman of strength who knew how to make medicine from roots and herbs when doctors refused to treat them. For Harold, poverty wasn't just an economic reality. It was a teacher. It taught him how to run faster than his circumstances, to push past the boundaries that others accepted as permanent. By the time he was 5, Harold was already known around the reserve for his speed. He could sprint across fields like the wind itself, and before long he found his true outlet, lacrosse. On the Six Nations Reserve, lacrosse wasn't just a game. It was a tradition, a sacred sport that connected generations. By the time Harold was 19, he was playing professionally for the Toronto Tecumsehs under the name Harry Smith. His brothers and cousins, with colorful nicknames like Porky, Beef, and Chubby, traveled with him, forming a team within a team. They played across Ontario, Buffalo, and upstate New York, often living out of borrowed rooms or cheap hotels, surviving on meager winnings. But the crowds loved them. Harold's speed was unmatched, so fast that during one game a fan shouted that his heels flashed like silver as he ran past defenders. The nickname stuck, Silverheels. It was a name that would follow him for the rest of his life. Newspapers began to call him the Flash from Six Nations, and soon people weren't just watching for the game. They were coming to see the man who could outrun anyone on the field. He wasn't just playing for money. He was running for recognition, for pride, and maybe deep down, to prove that someone from the reserve could stand out in a world that didn't think they mattered. But fame, even on a small scale, couldn't shield him from the deeper injustice that hung over every Indigenous family in Canada. During Harold's youth, residential schools were tearing communities apart. Children were taken from their families, stripped of their language, and punished for speaking Mohawk or practicing traditional ceremonies. Harold's own sister was one of them, sent away and returned home barely able to speak her own language. The government called it education, but it was cultural erasure. Families were told it was for their children's future, yet it only left them fractured and silent. Harold saw firsthand the damage it caused, the look in his mother's eyes every time a government agent came near. Even though he escaped the schools himself, their shadow followed him. It taught him early that being native was something the world wanted to change, not celebrate. That pain would later surface in his acting career, when Hollywood wanted him to play the noble Indian, but not the real one. When the Great Depression hit in the 1930s, everything that was fragile in Harold's world shattered. His family's already small income dried up. The reserve could no longer sustain them, so they moved to Buffalo, where Harold took on whatever work he could find. Farm labor, factory shifts, hauling freight. His father's condition worsened. His hearing gone, his back bent. His mother bartered family heirlooms for food, while government rations arrived spoiled or insufficient. Poverty, once a background noise, became the main story of their lives. But for Harold, this was also when his determination sharpened. He played lacrosse whenever he could, earning $75 per game, a small fortune during those years. The sport became both his passion and his ticket out. He wasn't just playing for the cheers. He was playing for survival. It wasn't long before the sports pages started paying attention. Reporters marveled at the young man who scored 4 or 5 goals per game, who could twist through defenders like smoke. Fans compared him to the fastest runners in the world. But Harold didn't see himself as a hero. He was a young man from a forgotten people, using every ounce of talent to carve a place in a world that refused to make space for him. He began to travel farther, joining leagues across the border, meeting new faces, and catching glimpses of a larger world that lay beyond the reserves and the cold streets of Buffalo. His confidence grew, not arrogance but quiet strength, the kind born of hardship. Then, one day, fate struck him down, literally. During a particularly rough game, a foul spiraled into a full-blown brawl. Harold fought back and was suspended. For most players, that would have been the end of their reputation. But when he returned, something strange happened. Ticket sales doubled. People wanted to see him. He had become a draw, not just for his skill, but for his fire. The same fire that had carried him through poverty now turned him into a local celebrity. Coaches started to rely on him to fill stadiums. It was the first taste of what public attention could feel like, and it wouldn't be the last. Even as he built his name in sports, Harold's curiosity stretched further. He began exploring other athletic pursuits, boxing among them. It was a new challenge, one that could test his limits and perhaps bring in steady income. He entered the Golden Gloves tournament in New York as a middleweight, facing opponents who had been training their whole lives. But Harold fought with the same fearlessness that had carried him through everything else. Punch after punch, he climbed the ranks, surprising everyone until the semifinals, when a single brutal blow shattered his jaw in 2 places. The crowd gasped. He was rushed to a hospital, his face swollen and wired shut. For weeks, he could only sip liquids through a straw. He lost nearly 30 pounds and was told he'd never box again. But for Harold, that was just another door closing and another waiting to open. He had learned long ago that survival meant reinvention. When his jaw finally healed, Harold returned to lacrosse. But something had changed. The world around him was shifting. The Depression had turned into war, and opportunities for indigenous athletes were drying up. He began to take small acting jobs in local shows and exhibitions, not because he dreamed of fame, but because someone noticed his commanding presence and athletic build. A scout suggested he try out for a film studio in Los Angeles. It sounded absurd. A poor Mohawk man from Ontario in Hollywood? But Harold decided to take the risk. He packed his few belongings, borrowed money for a ticket, and boarded a train to California. He arrived in Los Angeles with no contacts, no connections, and only a handful of dollars to his name. But he had something most people didn't: quiet persistence. At first, Hollywood didn't know what to do with him. Casting agents called him exotic or unusual. They asked him to stand in for Indian warriors in westerns, to sit on horses for background scenes. He took every job he could get. The pay was small, but it kept him fed. He began using the name Jay Silverheels, the same name that once made newspaper headlines back home. Slowly, he learned the language of the film world, how to move for the camera, how to hold still between takes, how to speak few words but fill them with presence. His athleticism made him stand out, and soon directors began to notice that he could do more than just stand in the background. He could act. He had intensity, emotion, and authenticity that few others could replicate. But Hollywood was not built for people like Jay Silverheels. He was pigeonholed before he even opened his mouth. Studios wanted stereotypes, braves, scouts, tribal chiefs. He was often told to play characters who grunted instead of spoke, or nodded silently beside white heroes. Yet Jay took those roles not out of acceptance, but out of necessity. For every line he spoke on screen, he endured countless lines of mockery off it. People mispronounced his name, made jokes about scalping, or asked if he really lived in a teepee. He smiled through it, just as his mother had smiled through years of being ignored by doctors, just as his father had endured the silence of his damaged ears. To survive meant to endure, and Jay had learned that lesson early. By the mid-1940s, he had built a modest resume. He appeared in films like Captain from Castile and Key Largo, playing small but memorable roles. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a start. And then came the role that would change everything: Tonto, the faithful companion to the Lone Ranger. When Jay was offered the part, he hesitated. He knew what it meant. Fame, yes, but also responsibility. To millions, he would become the face of Native America. Yet the script painted Tonto as little more than a sidekick, a helper whose broken English and unquestioning loyalty were written for comic effect. Jay wanted to turn that image into something dignified. He decided to take the role, not because he loved it, but because he hoped he could change it from within. What he didn't know then was how heavy that decision would become. When The Lone Ranger premiered on television in 1949, few could have predicted the cultural storm it would become. Families across America tuned in to watch the masked hero and his faithful companion ride into the sunset, bringing justice to the Old West. Jay Silverheels, now dressed in buckskin and mounted on horseback, became a household name. To millions, he wasn't Harold J. Smith from the Six Nations Reserve anymore. He was Tonto, the brave and loyal Indian who stood beside the Lone Ranger through every battle. Yet behind that fame, Jay carried a secret weight. Every time he rode into a scene, every time he delivered a line written in broken English, he knew what it meant. It meant millions of people were watching and learning about Native culture through a lens of ignorance. The character was meant to represent friendship, but to Jay, it often felt like servitude dressed as loyalty. When reporters asked him what he thought of his role, he sometimes smiled and said it was an honor. But once, in 1957, he couldn't hold it in any longer. When asked about Tonto, he quietly muttered, "Tonto is stupid." 3 words that revealed a lifetime of frustration. Jay wasn't bitter. He was tired. On set, he was treated as less than an equal. Clayton Moore, who played the Lone Ranger, earned nearly double Jay's salary, even though the show depended on their partnership. When Jay asked about equal pay, studio executives laughed it off. "You're lucky to have the role," they said. Some directors refused to call him by his real name, calling him Tonto even off camera. One director once tried to physically assault him after Jay spoke up about a scene that portrayed Native people as savages. He wasn't just fighting for respect. He was fighting for dignity in a world that denied it to him. He endured it all with quiet strength. Every insult, every slight he absorbed, because he believed someone had to stay. Someone had to be visible, even if visibility came with pain. Despite the limitations of his role, Jay tried to reshape Tonto in small but powerful ways. He added humility, wisdom, and a calm presence that made the character more human than the scripts allowed. Children across America saw Tonto as a hero, not a servant. Letters poured in from young fans who saw in him a quiet kind of courage. Jay cherished those letters. They reminded him that even if the industry didn't see his worth, the audience might. But he also couldn't ignore what Tonto represented to his own people. Many Native Americans criticized the show for reinforcing stereotypes, the silent, obedient Indian who lived only to help the white man. Jay understood their anger. He felt it too. But he saw no easy solution. "Someone has to be there," he once told a friend. "If I'm not, they'll just find someone who doesn't care." By the early 1950s, The Lone Ranger had become one of the most watched shows on television. Merchandise flooded stores, toys, lunchboxes, costumes, all featuring the masked man and his sidekick. Jay Silverheels became one of the most recognized faces in America, but fame didn't translate to fortune. While his co-star enjoyed steady income and publicity tours, Jay struggled to make ends meet. When the show went on hiatus, he sometimes worked construction or took small film roles to pay bills. The industry loved Tonto, but it didn't care much for the man behind him. In interviews, Jay often avoided discussing race or inequality, not because he didn't have opinions, but because he knew speaking too boldly could end his career. Hollywood wasn't ready to hear the truth from a native actor. It wanted him to smile, to ride, and to remain silent. Still, Jay found small victories. He began mentoring young native performers who came to Hollywood chasing dreams of their own. He saw in them the same hunger he once had, and the same dangers. He warned them about the roles they'd be offered, the way producers would try to mold them into caricatures. "Take the job if you must," he would say, "but never forget who you are." His quiet leadership turned into a movement of sorts. In the 1960s, he helped found the Indian Actors Workshop in Los Angeles, a group designed to train native actors not just in performance, but in self-respect. For Jay, it was a way to give back, to fight the system from within, one student at a time. He wanted the next generation to have the opportunities he never did, to play characters with depth, dignity, and truth. But the wounds Hollywood left were deep. Jay's relationship with the Lone Ranger grew complicated. While the public adored him, he carried resentment toward how his people were portrayed. The name Tonto, which meant fool or dummy in Spanish, followed him everywhere. Children would call out to him on the street, "Hey, Tonto!" And while he often smiled back, inside he felt the sting. He once joked, "It's strange being famous for playing a fool." He used humor to hide the pain, but those who knew him closely said he never truly made peace with it. Yet he never disowned the role. He saw it as part of his legacy, flawed but foundational. He believed that, despite its problems, it had opened the door for native actors to be seen, even if it was through a narrow lens. As the years passed, Jay began to take on other projects. He appeared in films like True Grit, Santee, and The Man Who Loved Cat Dancing, where he played more complex native characters. They were still written by white screenwriters, but Jay infused them with quiet strength and authenticity. His screen presence had evolved, less about action, more about soul. Off-screen, he became a voice for native representation in the arts. He appeared on talk shows, sometimes making jokes about his fame, sometimes gently educating audiences about native history and culture. He had learned to use humor as both shield and weapon. When asked about his Hollywood success, he once said, "I'm glad to be working. But one day, I hope we can play people, not symbols." Despite his achievements, the industry never gave him the full respect he deserved. Opportunities slowed in the 1970s as Westerns declined. The world had changed, or at least pretended to. Younger native actors were beginning to appear in films, some citing Jay Silverheels as their inspiration. Yet Jay's health was starting to fail. Years of hard work, long rides, and old sports injuries caught up to him. He suffered from diabetes and strokes in his later years, forcing him to retire from acting. He spent his final years in Los Angeles, surrounded by family and memories of a life that had meant more than most people knew. His friends said he remained gracious, reflective, and proud. Proud of where he came from, proud of how far he had gone. Even if the journey had been cruel, Jay Silverheels passed away on March 5, 1980, at the age of 67. The news hit quietly, barely a headline in most papers. The man who had once been one of television's most recognizable faces left the world with little fanfare. But among native communities, his death was deeply felt. He had been more than an actor. He had been a trailblazer, a symbol of perseverance in an industry that had little room for his kind. He was buried on the Six Nations Reserve where his journey began, among the same fields where he had first learned to run. For his people, he wasn't remembered as Tonto. He was remembered as Harold J. Smith, son of Alexander and Mabel, brother, athlete, actor, and fighter. In the years after his death, history began to shift. Hollywood slowly started to acknowledge its treatment of indigenous people, though progress came painfully slow. For a long time, Jay Silverheels' name remained tied to Tonto, to the sidekick image that had both made and trapped him. But as time went on, more people began to look deeper. They saw a man who turned a stereotype into a stepping stone, who fought for dignity in silence, who carried his heritage with pride even when the world mocked it. The irony of his career was that while he spent it being told to stand beside the hero, in reality, he was one. His courage wasn't loud or cinematic. It was quiet, patient, and enduring. The kind of courage that changes things, even if the change takes generations to be seen. In the years that followed his retirement, Jay Silverheels became something of a quiet mentor, especially to younger indigenous actors trying to find their footing in Hollywood. They came to him not for fame tips, but for understanding, for the strength to keep their dignity intact in an industry that often took it away. Jay would sit with them, sometimes over coffee, sometimes on the edge of a small stage in a community theater, and tell them, never let them tell you who you are. He was older now, slower, his hair turning silver like the nickname that once made him famous on the lacrosse field, but his eyes still burned with the same spirit that had carried him through every hardship. He started writing poetry again, small verses about the land, about silence, about ancestors watching from the trees. He even tried to produce his own stories, though few investors wanted to hear about native heroes who weren't sidekicks. Still, he tried, because he believed that someday the tide would turn. By the late 1970s, Jay had become something rare, a symbol of both Hollywood nostalgia and native resilience. Fans from across generations wrote to him, thanking him for Tonto, but others, especially indigenous youth, thanked him for something deeper. For proving that someone like them could stand in front of a camera, speak their truth, and not flinch. Though his health began to decline after a series of strokes, he continued to appear in public whenever he could, using a cane but always standing tall. In interviews, he often reflected on how things had changed and how far there still was to go. "They're starting to listen now," he said once with a tired smile. "But it's been a long road just to be heard." When Jay Silverheels passed away on March 5, 1980, the world didn't quite know how to measure his legacy. Some headlines called him Tonto, faithful companion, but others, especially in native communities, called him something far greater, a trailblazer who carried his people's dignity through decades of disrespect. He was the first Native American to have his name immortalized on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, but to his family, that wasn't the honor that mattered most. What mattered was that he never let fame erase his roots. Even when Hollywood tried to define him through a single role, he reminded everyone that he had been more a son, a poet, an athlete, a man who endured what others couldn't see. In the years after his death, the industry began to reckon with what it had done. Documentaries and interviews surfaced, revealing how much Jay had endured behind the scenes, the racism, the pay gap, the humiliation masked by a polite smile. His story became a lesson, not just about representation, but about humanity. He had once been told that playing Tonto was the highest he would ever rise. Yet decades later, young native filmmakers and actors would call him their foundation, the first crack in the wall that would eventually break open. In every performance that dared to show indigenous people as heroes, leaders and storytellers, a piece of Jay's spirit lived on. Today, when people watch the Lone Ranger reruns, they see more than a masked cowboy and his companion. They see a man who smiled for the camera while carrying the weight of generations. They see a warrior who fought with quiet grace, a trailblazer whose story is finally being told on his own terms. Jay Silverheels may have played Tonto, but his real legacy was never about being a sidekick. It was about standing tall, even when the world tried to keep him small. About turning silence into strength and pain into purpose.